Yo, what's going on, Yui gang? If this is your first time on the channel, I actually did a video series on no-hitting Radahn with every single melee weapon in the entire game. And as this is my first video of this kind, I'd like to start off by saying that you should probably take this entire ranking with a grain of salt and think of it as the 25 best weapons to use against Radahn type of list instead of an actual ranking, because I don't think I'm too good at ranking shit, if I'm being honest. I'm also reading mostly off of a script, so I'd like to apologize in advance if it sounds like absolute dog shit, but I do hope I can get my points across. There are going to be many weapons that are very similar to each other that could very well be on this list, but for the sake of having a variety of options, I decided it would be best to include only the best of the bunch for the most part. Starting off at number 25, we have the Great Omenkiller Cleaver, which is the lone great axe that comes with innate bleed. Now, initially I wasn't sure if I should include this because the Rusted Anchor can just outperform it, but being one of its kind in its respective class, I felt like it deserved to be here. Within the Cold Infusion, you're actually going to be getting very similar AR to most of the better heavy infused great axes in class while having some really respectable bleed buildup. You're obviously not going to be getting bleed procs left and right because of how slow great axes are, but it's definitely more than good enough to stand out as a bleed option. I also double checked, and this thing gets significantly more damage than the Great Stars. And since it's a great axe, you're going to get a faster and more, I would say, complementary moveset for this fight, albeit dealing less stance damage, but it's not too big of a deal. Number 24, the Nagakiba, which I would personally consider the best infusible katana. Now, originally I was a firm believer in the Rivers of Blood being able to outperform this thing, but that's simply not true. A keen Bloodflame Blade Nagakiba or Uchi Katana will, in fact, be able to outperform the Rivers of Blood in this instance. As for what makes this weapon so good, it's an infusible katana with innate bleed, the highest range in class, and piercing heavy attacks. You're gonna have access to things like Double Slash for consistent multi-hit stacking and bleed buildup, or Unsheath, which is very good at breaking stance and very high damaging, especially after the Rolana's cameo buffs. Overall, I'd consider this weapon an absolute jack of all trades and would highly recommend using it. Number 23, the Halo Scythe, which is, in my opinion, one of the more surprising weapons of this challenge. On its own, you're looking at a rather slow scythe with a mediocre moveset, with a fairly solid damage split for this fight, but where this thing really shines is its wholly based Ash of War, Miquella's Ring of Light. Quite ironic. Being an upgraded version of Sacred Ring of Light, you're looking at projectiles that come out and travel very fast, deal massive damage, and cover like half the arena. There are times where you can straight up skip the first phase of this fight simply because of how Radahn interacts with projectiles. Now, as with all holy based options, you're looking at a significant damage fall off entering phase 2, but considering the free damage you're getting off of both Radahn's Lightspeed dash attack and Light of Miquella, it continues to cheese almost all of the fight. Number 22, the Claws of Night. On their own, you're looking at the highest combined AR out of all the claws, albeit having split magic damage. This, combined with the fact that using a claw already makes for a fantastic weapon, but where this thing really pops off is its Ash of War, Scattershot throw. The damage you can rack up with this Ash point blank, combined with how fast it actually comes out, makes for a ridiculous punish for almost all of his even slightly longer openings. You're also going to be dealing some respectable chip damage at those longer ranges. Now, a slight issue I did run into is that you aren't really fully able to capitalize on your bleed because you're simply doing too much damage to ever get it off, but is that a bad thing really? Number 21, the Zamor Curved Sword, which is just an absolute abomination of a weapon. Without its Ash of War, you are looking at an incredibly mediocre and, I would say, irrelevant weapon. But this thing just so happens to have one of the strongest Ashes of Wars in the entire game. Zamor Ice Storm. This Ash comes out very fast, does both fantastic damage and stance damage, and most importantly is the fastest way in the entire game of proccing Frost on an enemy alongside its spell counterpart. It scales purely off of upgrade levels, so the only way to further boost its damage would be stuff like the magic tier, spells, and talismans, of which you are in luck. Combining this thing with stuff like the Shard of Alexander, the Magic Scorpion Charm, and the newly added Enraged Divine Beast makes for a completely ridiculous Ash of War, able to cheese the entire fight. Number 20, the Backhand Blade. An absolute DPS monster of a weapon, having access to Blind Spot, which I'd argue is one of the best Ashes of War to have in this fight. Now, besides being able to stack multi-hit in the blink of an eye, you're looking at fantastic recovery frames on most of the attacks, along for many quick, cheeky R1s in between many of his combos. I'd probably recommend opting for a Bleed Infusion over Keen, even though you are missing out on quite a chunk of AR, simply because of how good this thing is at building up status, but you can't go wrong with either. Number 19, the Carian Thrusting Shield, which is going to be a slightly better version of the Dueling Shield in my opinion. All this weapon really has to work with are its light and heavy attacks, but that is all you will ever need. Not only do these things get some very nice AR, but you're going to be doing pure piercing damage, which as a general rule of thumb is fantastic for this fight, given that Radahn is so weak to piercing damage. The main thing going for this weapon in my opinion would be its rather slow but high motion value heavy attack and the fast recovery speed rolling R1s, which you can get off in between a ton of his combos. One thing I wish these were a bit better at is their stance damage, but they still perform absolutely fantastic. Number 18, the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword. This bad boy has quite a lot of things going for it. It's a colossal sword, meaning you're going to be doing great stance damage with your light and heavy attacks. You've got that Zweihander moveset with those super nice piercing heavy attacks as well as the rolling light attacks. And finally, its Ash of War white light charge is just ridiculous. You mainly benefit off of AR when it comes to the skill, of which this weapon gets some of the highest physical AR in class, only really beaten by the Grafted Blade Greatsword. Now when you pair that with your already extremely powerful piercing attacks, you have yourself a beast of a colossal sword for this fight. Number 17, the Pickaxe, which I consider the little brother of the Rusted Anchor, since it also does pure piercing damage. Now, just like with the Omenkiller Cleaver, I was hesitant to include this on the list due to the Rusted Anchor existing, but it does have one unique thing going for it, and that being its heavy attack. Now this thing actually shares the same heavy attack as the Grey Club, which is a very fast, high damaging, high stance damage heavy attack, which does piercing damage, and as we all know, piercing damage for this fight is just muy bueno. This is without a doubt the best Great Hammer to use against Radahn in my opinion. Number 16, the Moonveil, which I would personally consider the best katana for this fight. Now in terms of raw damage, the Moonveil's Ash of War is actually outperformed by a magic Uchi katana with Unsheath, but in my opinion, the Moonveil remains on top, and that is for two reasons. One, you're able to use the skill as a very nice mid-range option, since most of the damage actually comes from the projectile. And two, the light attack version of the Ash of War actually does double the stance damage Unsheath would do at point blank, allowing for more constant and consistent stance breaks. All of these things combined makes for a complete monster of a weapon, especially after the buffs to Rellana's cameo. Number 15, the Fire Knight's Greatsword. The reason I chose this over the Zweihander is how easy it is to reach high AR, even at those lower levels if you just run Pure Faith and a Flame Art infusion. Having access to those piercing heavy attacks as well as the rolling light attacks combined with the ridiculous AR and stance damage you'll be getting should be proof enough of why I rank this thing so highly. This is a very straightforward weapon, and when combined with a charged heavy build and Ashes of War like Flame Spear, Flame Skewer, or Royal Knight's Resolve makes for nothing less of a fun experience against Radahn. Number 14, the Cipher Pata, a pure holy based dual fist weapon. This thing might have just been the most surprising weapon of this challenge to me honestly, and that is mostly going to be due to its damage type and Ash of War unblockable blade. For the pretty low cost of 17 FP, you have the ability to lunge forward in a really fast animation, dealing big amounts of damage and a respectable 30 stance damage. Now, most of its power does lie in Radahn's phase 1 since he has 0 holy resistance, but even in phase 2 this thing still hits pretty hard and can break stance really quickly. Despite its description, this thing of course does not deal any piercing damage whatsoever, which is quite the tragedy, but I wouldn't say it needs it in order to perform as well as it already does, so yeah. Number 13, the Sword Lance, which I without a doubt consider the best heavy thrusting sword in the entire game. Not only do you get piercing damage, ridiculous AR, but for some godforsaken reason this thing gets colossal weapon type status buildup when infusing it with bleed. Now as many of you know by now, shield poking is an incredibly viable strat against this boss, and when it comes to the Sword Lance, this thing just does it the absolute best. Even without bleed, this thing hits like an absolute truck when running a charged heavy build, or running Ashes of War like Giant Hunt and Piercing Fang. Number 12, the Venomous Fang, which can actually get the highest AR out of all of the infusible claws. Things like the Raptor Talons or Bloodhound claws will end up getting higher DPS due to their bleed, but that doesn't make the Venomous Fang any less of an absolute menace. Within the cold infusion, you're looking at roughly 150 poison buildup, which, when paired with a claw, makes for some of the fastest status buildup in the entire game. Wearing things like the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation or Mushroom Crown will work absolute wonders with this weapon, and since the release of the DLC, you also have access to the Ash of War, the Poison Flower blooms twice, which, to be honest, is just broken on this thing. This thing has so much going for it: high DPS, stupid poison buildup, and some of the highest burst damage in the entire game with the Poison Flower blooms twice, albeit requiring a little bit of setup. Number 11, the Golden Halberd, which I could imagine comes as quite of a surprise to most people. This thing is all about raw damage, and if I tell you this thing hits like an absolute truck, it sure fucking does. Unfortunately, this thing does come with Golden Bow, which you could argue makes other options more favorable, but I'm going to be the number 1 Golden Halberd glazer and say to hell with that argument. Just look at that frickin' damage. Number 10, the Messmer Soldier's Spear, which I'd like to consider the best weapon for charge heavies in the entire game, alongside the Bloodfiend's arm. For how much AR this thing can get with a simple heavy infusion and how much motion value you actually get on its completely stupid double poking heavy attack, this is just simply one of your best piercing damage options, not only for this fight, but in the entire game in my opinion. Just slap Cragblade or Royal Knight's Resolve on this thing and you have one of the most high damaging weapons in the entire game for this fight. Number 9, the Warped Axe. There are quite a few things that make this weapon as strong as it is. You're gonna have access to a really fast light attack combo that is unique to this, the Messmer Soldier Spear, and the Ripple Blade. The Warped Axe has the highest raw damage out of all the infusible axes, scaling incredibly well off of strength. And most importantly, when running a bleed infusion, you're looking at an A scaling retain in strength, with the bleed buildup you would normally see on something like a Great Axe or a Great Hammer for some reason. Put all of these things together and you have yourself a complete DPS monster of a weapon, especially in those longer openings Radahn has. Number 8, the Cleanrot Knight's Sword, which is going to be the best thrusting sword in terms of raw damage and DPS. You can also very gladly go for the Anspur Rapier, which performs absolutely fantastic as well with that added rot, but since I personally value the raw damage more, I'm gonna go with this. Thrusting swords in general are just so damn good for this fight. They have a super fast moveset, they have piercing damage, and this particular weapon just does all of that the best. An absolutely fantastic option. Number 7, the Spiked Caestus, the weapon that wishes it was a Starfist and has nearly as much going for it. As with the Pickaxe, I did not want to include this weapon on the list originally simply because of the Starfist, but hear me out. You're gonna be getting a worse moveset, a little bit less raw damage and stance damage with this thing, but what makes you want to include it is its slightly higher bleed buildup. I haven't done any extensive testing on either of these weapons, but I feel like you'll definitely be able to benefit off of bleed more with this thing than the Starfist. There were a lot of times where you'd not actually get a bleed proc off with the Starfist in phase 1, whereas with the Spiked Caestus, you could do so, and pretty consistently at that. And for that reason, I really do feel like it deserved to be here as nothing less of an absolutely fantastic option for this fight. Number 6, the Wing of Astel, the in my opinion best stance breaking tool in the entire game. Its Ash of War and Nebula shoots out a myriad of little explosions which are very high damaging and each do 13 stance damage. Now, the unfortunate part about the skill in this fight is that you're only ever going to hit 3 of those explosions at the very most, which to be honest is already good since that'll be like 39 stance damage, but that's not even it. The animation for the skill is so fast that in those longer openings, you can actually get in uncharged heavies dealing 16 stance damage, which is already ridiculous, or even a charged heavy dealing 43 stance damage. 43 stance damage with a charged heavy. This is, without a doubt, the best int-based weapon in the game for fighting Radahn. The totally unbiased number 5, my beloved Rusted Anchor, the in my opinion best piercing damage weapon for this fight. Luckily, I don't have to explain this weapon too much as there really isn't all too much to it. It gets very high AR, very fast charged and uncharged heavy attacks because of all of the Great Axe buffs that all hit like a truck and do very good stance damage. It might also be worth looking into a bleed infusion with this thing since it does get some very nice build-up while retaining some pretty decent AR. Number 4, the Euporia. Now we're getting into absolutely broken territory, and starting off with the Euporia, this thing performs like a hot knife slicing through butter. It does come with 2 downsides which I personally don't really care for, which is 1, it takes a hot minute to build up your luster, which I found to be very negligible, and 2, your Ash of War is nearly unusable in this fight. Given how long the animation is, there's no scenario in which you could ever safely get this thing off besides maybe Light of Mikela, but I may not even consider losing your luster effect for that worth it unless you know you'll kill him with it. I haven't done any extensive testing regarding that, so I may be wrong, but overall this thing just performs stupidly well. Number 3, the Raptor Talons, which are in my opinion the best claws in the entire game. Yes, the Bloodhound claws do get ever so slightly more AR, but for what you're getting in return, it is completely negligible. You're getting more bleed buildup, a significant 10% increase in motion value for their jumping attacks, and the absolute best heavy attack out of all of the claws, by far. Want to do a jumping attack build? Go for it. Want to focus on bleed? Tapping R2 is your friend. Want to go for charge heavies? Go for it. This thing has pretty much everything that makes a weapon good except really high stance damage. It is amazing. Number 2, the Starfist. It should be pretty common knowledge by now that this is one of the best weapons in the entire game. You're doing great hammer types of damage and roughly 36 stance damage with a charged heavy and Cragblade, which is nearing the same stance damage as a charged colossal heavy. Like, what the actual fuck is that? And with how fast the animation actually comes out, I think you can imagine for how ridiculous of a stance breaking tool that makes. Oh, and hey, here's some added bleed on top as well because this weapon isn't good enough already, right? I did also do some testing, and as with most of these cases, running a heavy infusion with Bloodfiend Blade will most likely perform better than Occult and Cragblade. The only downside I could think of with this weapon is that you have to manually aim your heavy attack a lot of the time, but it's really not hard to do, and I don't think it matters. This thing is just absolutely broken. Before we move on to number 1, I do have some honorable mentions that I think could work just as well as most of the weapons on this list, and those would be the Death Ritual Spear, Siluria's Tree, the Falling Star Beast Jaw, the Dark Moon Greatsword, and finally the Claymore. All of these options will perform extremely well, and I highly recommend you give each and every one of them a try as well. And finally, at number 1, the Bloodfiend's Arm, more commonly known as the Chicken Wing. This thing single-handedly made the Great Club obsolete, since the only thing it had going for it was its unique, very high stance damage, fast animation heavy attack, as I mentioned before. But hey, here you have an upgrade of that same attack on a weapon that can get upwards of 200 build-up when running a Bleed Infusion, able to do roughly 47 stance damage on a charged heavy attack that, I kid you not, is 1 frame faster than the charged heavy attack of a straight sword? Like, I don't know how they shipped this weapon. Something also very noteworthy is just how well this thing performs with a Sacred Infusion. With a Sacred Infusion, a singular charged heavy with Royal Lance Resolve can probably send him into phase 2 if I were to guess. I am not kidding. It is that strong. I also really just can't help but to wonder if the heavy attack was even intended to work with status like that, because it just seems so silly to me how fast the thing can get off bleed. Either way, without having to even go into further detail, I can safely say that I found this weapon to be the most effective and busted tool to use against Radahn. Well, that'll be it for the ranking. That was pretty taxing to make, honestly. This is like the first video of this kind I've ever made, so sorry if this was a complete flop. I've actually prepared tier lists for each weapon class as well for the people that are interested in that shit. But before that, I just wanted to say thanks for watching all the way through the video, and let me know if you want to see videos of similar fashion in the future. Anyways, bye bye and enjoy the tier lists.